How to use the 80-20 principle in business. There are many helpful tactical uses of the 80-20 principle to help your organization or your career. For instance, it can be used in negotiations, including to get yourself a pay raise, and also in your personal life. But since I don't want to repeat what I've said in an earlier book, I'm going to concentrate here on the strategic ways to use the principle in business. The key insight is that your firm almost certainly does too much. The hypothesis is that 20% of what it does leads to 80% of the benefit. If this is true, it follows that the firm should do more of the 20% or similar activity, but very little of the 80%. The firm should do much less. Too abstract? Let me be more concrete. Your firm should do less, but more profitably. Whichever way you cut it, the firm should concentrate on its most productive and profitable elements and activities and forget or hive off the rest. So what should it do less of? Try these for starters. The firm should own less. The firm should acquire less and divest more. The firm should try to participate in fewer stages of the value chain. The firm should have fewer products. The firm should have fewer customers. The firm should have fewer suppliers. And the firm should have fewer employees. Let's now take a look at each one of those statements. Own less. Managers like to own things. These might go up in value, and it's generally believed that ownership enables us to control what is owned. Alas, very often the reverse is true, both in business and life. Our possessions end up controlling us. In business, it is now clear that the obsession with owning things is passé. We don't need to own things to control revenue and profit streams. And there are severe disadvantages to ownership when compared to the non-ownership options. By definition, half of the world's total business assets destroy value. They fail to earn the average return on capital. Having them, therefore, destroys value. If this sounds too much like a theoretical construct, look at the following examples of value creation and capture without very much ownership. As I write, British pay TV channel B Sky B has a market value in excess of £10 billion. Yet, it has a small asset base and broadcasts programs that it does not create or own. Or take Canon and Microsoft. As strategy professor Marcus Alexander writes, Canon's dominance of the inner workings of the fax machine, or Microsoft's position as the arbiter of PC standards, effectively capture a disproportionate amount of value through minimal but selective ownership. Similarly, McDonald's and a huge number of other businesses control their suppliers. They tell the suppliers precisely what to do and often have exclusive arrangements without the need for any ownership. This is one meaning of the incredibly prevalent term virtual company. Branded manufacturers of autos and PCs are usually nowadays nothing of the sort. The truth is that they contract out not just manufacture, but often large chunks of design and sub-assembly. They don't own, yet they do control. Some airlines approach virtuality. They lease their planes, they buy in their engineering, maintenance, catering, ground support services, ticket sales, and in some cases, even their pilots and cabin crew. You trust that they control these activities. You trust the brand, yet they are not owned. Whole industries like oil exploration and production are becoming increasingly virtual. Even government is discovering that it can control the delivery of welfare services without having to own them. There are 4 advantages to controlling without owning. 1 is that it takes less cash, so return on capital can go up, and in some cases reach astronomical levels. The extreme is the professional service firm that can own almost literally nothing, and yet control and deliver a highly branded, highly differentiated, and highly valued service. The second advantage is that you can focus effort on less activity and become really superb at your narrow specialty. Conversely, if you own something, you have to pay some attention to it. Third, if you can control rather than own, you get instant access to the people who are best at each activity. Try comparing this to what you can get in-house. Often the outside supplier can deliver a better product, cheaper than the in-house alternative, and make a fat profit into the bargain. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, controlling without owning leads to flexibility, speed, and the avoidance of unnecessary surpluses paid to internal staff. If you own a division or activity, it creates what Marcus Alexander calls ownership inflexibility. He writes, "Organizations typically evolve around the needs of certain dominant activities or processes. This creates inflexibility in accommodating the different needs of less central processes. This can be seen in the inflated wage rates historically paid to unskilled or semi-skilled workers in the oil, chemical, and pharmaceutical industries, where the dominant processes involve better paid and hard-to-attract professionals. Inflexibility is also apparent when owning assets, such as bank branch networks or production plants based on obsolete technology or high-cost labor that actually prevent firms from adopting the solutions preferred by customers. Ownership may enable you to control today's processes at the expense of missing out on tomorrow's. Since knowing how to do something for customers better and cheaper is the only secure basis for companies to make a living, and since knowledge resides ultimately in people, and since slavery has been abolished, I could argue that it is impossible to own the most important components of corporate success in any case. Similarly, many activities that appear to involve ownership need not actually do so. Buildings, computers, communication lines, manufacturing equipment, and almost everything else that appears to give substance to companies can be leased or hired. Own only the 20% that contributes 80% of effective control. And if control is possible without ownership, don't own anything. Acquire less. It is a paradox that profits can be produced without ownership, and yet the easiest way for managers to spend enormous amounts of money is to acquire other companies, which themselves may own very little. Why use capital to acquire firms when the underlying operation can be conducted with very little use of capital? A partial explanation is that access to a stream of profits is worth paying for. This is only a partial explanation because it can't explain why acquisition is more prevalent than building businesses from scratch, where much less capital can generate much more cash in the long run, or why the prices paid for acquisitions, as measured by price-to-earnings ratios, have escalated way beyond sensible calculations of value. Nor can the stream of profits explanation tell us why we should use scarce capital to pay shareholders of an existing business, who themselves have probably provided far less capital than the business is said to be worth, when a higher long-term return is likely from organic expansion using little capital. The paradox can only be explained, I believe, by what I call the false market in acquisitions. Acquisitions are more expensive than is economically justified only because managers prefer to buy than to sell, and because managers have a shorter time horizon than is good for the owners of the businesses or anyone else. Building companies takes too long for managers to reap the benefit personally. In the market for companies, there are more buyers than sellers. Or rather, there would be, at economically sensible prices. Inflated prices are necessary to reach equilibrium where the number of buyers and sellers is equal. This does not mean that all acquisitions are stupid or too expensive, only that the average acquisition is, and all the below-average ones are. Conversely, not all divestments add value, but well over half do. Mergers and acquisitions, M&A, are still growing, although if you deduct spin-offs, demergers, and unbundlings from the total, this is not true. But even accepting this growth, the alternative form of combination, that is, corporate alliance, is growing even faster. Corporate alliance is often a better alternative to acquisition. The global auto market now resembles a tangled mass of spaghetti, a complex network of relationships. Alliances are also the dominant trend in the financial services industry, in computers, and in telecommunications. Nor need alliances be confined to one industry. Coca-Cola, McDonald's, and Disney have a global alliance that benefits them all, combining Coke's brand and marketing, McDonald's distribution strengths, and Disney's branded characters. Virgin uses its brand to enter other businesses, but often without doing anything else, and certainly without acquisition. It is often easier, and nearly always much cheaper, to get what you want from another company via alliance rather than acquisition. Participate in fewer stages of the value chain. The value chain is all the activities that lie between the conception of a product or service and its arrival in the hands of the customer. So it involves research and development, product design, component manufacture, assembly and processing, branding and marketing, selling, physical distribution and delivery, after-sales service, and any other stages that are relevant to your own industry. If, like most businesses, you participate in more than one of these stages, you are unlikely to be equally good when compared to the best competitor in both or all stages. Many very successful businesses focus all or nearly all their energies on one or two stages of the value chain. Companies that just do oil exploration, or production, or marketing have tended to be more profitable than the integrated majors. Firms like Filofax, that used to undertake substantial elements of product manufacture, are more profitable now that they have focused on product design, branding, and marketing. In baby buggies and strollers, companies that just brand and market, or that just manufacture, are more profitable than the firms that do it all. Hotel corporations are dividing themselves into units that own and manage property, and units that operate hotels. The profits of the Coca-Cola Company leapt after it divested its bottling and physical distribution operations. Concentrate on the 20% of activities where you add 80% of the value. Have fewer products. Examine your product profitability. A good hypothesis is that 20% of product will generate 80% of profits. By definition, the bottom half of products are depressing your average return on capital. It's also likely that the bottom half of products don't meet your required rate of return, and possible that a good chunk of them are actually loss makers. If your products conform to the typical pattern, A 20% increase in sales of the most profitable products will lead to an 80% increase in profits. Even a 10% sales increase, if concentrated in the most profitable products, will probably lead to a 40 to 60% profit increase. Conversely, a 10 to 20% drop in the least profitable products is likely to lead to an increase in profits, even if no overhead is cut. If overhead can be cut in line with sales, then over a year or so you may be able to cut sales by a third and increase absolute profits, as well as dramatically increasing the return on capital. Have fewer customers. The same logic applies to customers. Sometimes customers are more or less profitable because of the mix of products that they take. Sometimes because they pay higher or lower prices, but very frequently because they take differential amounts of energy and cost to serve. In most businesses today, the majority of internal cost lies in that exclusive beast, overhead. Overhead is very rarely allocated to customers, yet when this is done, even very approximately, it becomes apparent that some customers require a great deal more overhead cost than others, relative to the sales that they take. Generally, the most profitable customers are those that have been customers for a long time. Gaining new customers is very expensive. If they are not suitable in the first place, or if they are lost quickly, the cost of acquiring these customers may be much greater than the benefit from having them. It follows that the best customers are generally your existing customers, and that efforts to retain and increase their business with you will have a disproportionate effect on current profits, and even more importantly, on future profits. Retaining and selling more to the most profitable existing customers has an enormous value that will never be apparent from conventional accounting reports. Losing your worst customers means that you can provide a better service to your best ones and others like them. Have fewer suppliers. It is easier to think of customer or product profitability than of supplier profitability, but supplier profitability is just as important and just as differential. Take 10 suppliers. Assume that each charges you $1 million a year for supplies. The 80-20 principle supplies an intriguing hypothesis. 80% of the real value is contained in 20% of the supplies. If we assume that your return on sales is 10%, and that this applies equally to bought-in and in-house activities, it follows that the real value to you of the $10 million of bought-in goods and services is actually $11 million. The hypothesis is, therefore, that $2 million of supplies are worth $8.8 million. That's 80% of $11 million. And that the remaining $8 million of supplies are worth only the remaining $2.2 million. Wouldn't it be nice to identify the supplies where each dollar buys you $4.40 worth of value? Wouldn't you tend to buy more of these supplies? Wouldn't you have a strong incentive to sell more of the products and services that are particularly intensive in their use of the profitable supplies? Wouldn't it also be useful to stop making large losses on the majority of supplies bought in if the hypothesis turned out to be correct? Actually, I can't prove that it is. There have been thousands of studies of customer and product profitability that have reproduced the rough 80-20 pattern. But because it is much more difficult to measure supplier profitability, both conceptually and practically, than it is to measure customer or product profitability, I can cite no empirical studies to back up my point about suppliers. Here's a gap in the product line of management consultants that some enterprising firm should plug. I am confident, however, that some supplies are more profitable than others. There have been studies showing that firms with fewer suppliers are more profitable than comparable firms with more suppliers. One reason for this is that simplicity has high value. But another reason is that firms with fewer suppliers are likely to have deliberately picked the most profitable ones. Another cause of widely different supplier profitability is the disparity in their bargaining power. Some suppliers create a terrific amount of value but capture only a small share of it, either because the supplier is small relative to the customer, or because the supplier has few possible customers, or simply because the supplier is not maximizing what it could take. At the other extreme, some suppliers almost certainly take more than they give, either because they are skilled in value capture, or because the cost to the purchasing organization is low, or because the purchaser has poor information. And finally, have fewer employees. This is a touchy subject, but it has long been apparent, both to objective academics and to reflective managers, that in every organization, some individuals add a great deal more value than they extract, whereas for other individuals, the reverse is true. Where we can measure individual productivity easily, as with salespeople, the 80-20 principle has been validated. Both 80% of sales and 80% of the profits from sales are generated by roughly 20% of salespeople. What is true of individuals in any function or activity is also true between groups. In every organization, there is a small core of individuals in one particular type of function or activity who generate the most spectacular profits relative to their cost, and a majority of people in other functions and activities who add little value beyond their cost, or who cost more than they are worth. In the consulting firms where I worked, for example, the real value was added at the top and the bottom of the firm, at the level of the best partners and at the most junior professional level, where young analysts were cheap, bright, and incredibly hardworking. The partners sold and thought. The young analysts did most of the work. The run-of-the-mill consultants pretended to do something useful in between and were expensive. In most pharmaceutical companies, it's a few scientists and engineers in the labs who add most of the value. In Microsoft, it's probably Bill Gates, a few of his very top executives, and a few of the most creative software nerds. In investment banks, the real profits are generated by the few traders who consistently call their market right, the few analysts who pick excellent investments for the bank's own balance sheet, and the few rainmakers who bring in the mega deals. In all these organizations, every other cadre and every other individual is seriously overpaid, just because they're there and the organization can afford to overpay them. Keep the 20% or fewer of employees who add most of the value and work out how to export the rest, whether by outsourcing, spin-offs, natural wastage, or less agreeable means. If this is impossible, form a spin-off comprising the most valuable cadre of individuals. The simple firm. The changes I am recommending have a multiplicative effect, even if you only take small steps in each. Even if each change is modest, the firm that owns less, acquires less, divests more, reduces its scope in terms of value-added activities, trims its product line, and reduces its number of customers, suppliers, and employees, will find itself much less complex than when it started. Complexity adds cost. It also makes executives and the whole firm slow, inward-looking, and deaf to customers. Simplicity changes the firm's ratio between useful cost and useless cost. Complex organizations spend most of their energy on their own processes. Only simple firms can devote most of their efforts to doing useful things for customers. The firm that does more with less is not necessarily a small firm. Because it does more, the firm may end up being very large indeed, or at least very valuable. The most valuable firm in the world is Microsoft, which is not a small firm. Yet it is a simple firm. Simple is beautiful. Return on management employed, ROME. Probably the defining, most important business concept of the 20th century was ROCE, Return on Capital Employed. The defining business concept of the 21st century could prove to be ROME, which stands for Return on Management Employed, or Return on Management Effort. ROME is increasingly more important than ROCE. The scarce resource is focused, insightful, value-adding executives, not capital. Ideas, brains, knowledge, technical skills, and the sheer ability to get sensible things done. These have more value and rarity than cash. Whether it knows it or not, the simple firm has worked this out. It is trying to maximize ROME, not ROCE. More complex firms will do well to classify all their business segments on a 2x2 matrix, looking at ROME and ROCE. Only businesses with high ROCE and high ROME will be retained as part of the core. The rest should be spun off or sold. Even businesses with high ROCE are not really as profitable as they look if they also have a low ROME. They are hogging the scarce resource. Financial controllers and CFOs are looking out for high ROCE and are parsimonious with cash. Who is looking out for ROME? Who is ensuring that it is doled out parsimoniously only to businesses with really good returns? Focus on the 20% of businesses that have high ROCE and high ROME, the few that really do offer great returns on what is truly scarce. If there is a conflict between ROCE and ROME, give priority to the latter. Charm. In the 1950s, particle physicists working in quantum electrodynamics, known as QED, began developing electroweak theory. In the 1970s, Sheldon Lee Glashow, born in 1932, son of a Russian immigrant to the U.S., proved that in addition to the subatomic quarks called up, down, and strange, there was a fourth quark, dubbed charm. The theory explains how particles interact with each other. Strong subatomic forces, apparently, require weak forces as a necessary complement. Sociologists have developed the parallel theory of the power of weak ties. The power of weak ties. A weak tie is one where there is no direct ownership, financial interest, control, contract, or affiliation, but where there is some connection as a result of knowledge, indirect links, a friend of a friend, geography, professional group, or some other accidental or incidental conduit. One example of the power of weak ties is how people find out about jobs. Apart from advertisements and headhunters, the main source of information is not from close friends and family or existing employers, but via informal networks, friends of friends, and information randomly accessed from other sources. Or take two communities threatened with disruption by major road projects. In one community, there were plenty of strong ties within monolithic organizations, like the church, a few large organizations, and the local council, but few links across the boundaries of the strong ties. Each group kept itself to itself. In the other community, there were few strong ties, but a multiplicity of weak ties between smaller clusters of interest groups, none of which was itself very strong or influential. In the first community, the monolithic groups each kicked up an enormous fuss, but could not mobilize across a broad front. Each group was ignored. In the second community, the weak ties gradually produced a groundswell of united ad hoc protest that was successful in blocking the road project. Silicon Valley epitomizes the power of weak ties. Here are a large number of independent, fiercely competitive businesses. It is far from a monolithic industrial structure where there are a few large firms enjoying cozy relationships with each other, and yet there are ties between the firms and the people. Executives swap jobs frequently. They gossip in bars, they go to industry conventions, they engage in ad hoc collaboration. They play sport together, they share information. By way of contrast, Route 128 outside of Boston has the same industrial structure, many competing firms, but far fewer of the informal weak ties. People are much more secretive and insulated from each other, and engage far less in a wide range of social contacts. The power of weak ties is closely related to another power law we examined in Chapter 5, Jared Diamond's principle of intermediate fragmentation, which states that you don't want excessive unity and you don't want excessive fragmentation. Instead, you want your human society or business to be broken up into a number of groups that compete with each other, but that also maintain relatively free communication. So what? The power of weak ties illuminates both the 80-20 principle and the way in which influence can be exerted across boundaries. If weak ties will do, you don't need strong ties. You don't need ownership. You don't even need control. You can achieve 80% of your objective with only 20% of the ammunition. In fact, strong ties may be less effective than weak ties, because strong ties encourage a sense of internal identity that removes the appetite for, or the ability to digest, a whole range of weak external ties. Von Forster's theorem. Derived from modern cybernetic theory, von Forster's theorem says that the more rigidly connected parts of a system are, the less influence they will have on the system as a whole. Each rigidly connected element of the system will be more alienated from the whole system. Excessive control can therefore be counterproductive, and will certainly lower the potential value and cohesion of the whole system. Why is it that organizations often find it more difficult to deal with sister companies than those where there is no ownership link? Why do executives often find their own weak ties, their own informal networks held together by nothing more than chance, vague mutual empathy, and the possibility of doing useful business together, more useful than the strong ties of organizational culture and common interest? The 50-5 principle. The 50-5 principle is very useful and very snappy. Typically, 50% of a company's customers, products, components, and suppliers comprise a mere 5% or less of sales and profits. The profits may even be negative. Therefore, eliminate the low-volume customers, products, components, and suppliers. Result? Only a very small drop in sales, but a large reduction in complexity. Whether or not the numbers show it, an increase in real profits is almost inevitable. For instance, in the early 1990s, Corning conducted a 50-to-5 analysis at two plants producing ceramic substrates for auto exhaust systems, one in Greenville, Ohio, and the other in Kaiserslautern, Germany. The 50-to-5 principle worked. Out of the 450 products made at Greenville, half produced 96.3% of total sales. The other 50% of products yielded just 3.7%. At the German plant, the bottom half of products produced only 2 to 5% of sales, depending on the time period analyzed. In both places, the bottom 50% made losses. They were eliminated, resulting in much simpler businesses, and before long, a 25% reduction in engineering overhead. Because it is less radical and less threatening, it's often best to start with the 50-to-5 analysis and then move on to 80-20 analysis. Mendeleev's periodic table of elements. A methodology with strong similarities to the 80-20 principle was developed in 1869 by Dmitry Mendeleev, 1834 to 1907, a great Russian chemist. Looking at chemical elements and trying to find their underlying unity, Mendeleev noticed that, as he said, the size of the atomic weight determines the nature of the elements. Chemicals with similar properties have similar weights. Manganese, to which Mendeleev's 1869 table assigned the relative atomic weight of 55, and iron, which has a weight of 56, for example. Mendeleev's table of elements enabled him to successfully predict the properties of yet-to-be-discovered elements. Mendeleev's genius was to look for just one key variable that could explain different properties. This is similar to the concept of the vital few as opposed to the trivial many, except that in this case it was just one dimension that was vital. Recall the parallel with Isaac Newton's discovery that the force of gravity was proportional to the mass of bodies to the inverse of their distance from each other. In this case, just two variables are needed to make sense of movement everywhere. Whether it is just one key variable, or two, or a few, the key to understanding anything seems to be to simplify it and identify a very small number of powerful causes. Not everything is susceptible to such discrete analysis, but many important things are. It is always worth trying to isolate between 1 and 3 important variables that may be causing most or all of what you are trying to explain. Why profits have gone down, for example. If you can't explain most or all of the difference through fewer than 4 variables, it's probably time to give up analysis and experiment instead. Control theory. The 80-20 principle implies that we should reduce the number of things that we are trying to control. On a vital few things, however, it may be appropriate to exercise extremely tight control. Control theory can help here. In physics and biology, control mechanisms regulate dynamic processes to achieve the controller's objectives. The basic idea is terribly simple. You monitor what is happening, and if the system isn't doing exactly what you want it to do, you whack it back on course via repeated corrections, called negative feedback. Many biological processes exemplify negative feedback. The population of a species rises, food becomes scarce. The population then falls back to a sustainable level. Thermostats and air conditioning are based on control theory. Attempts are now being made to use it to control complex systems such as irregular heartbeats, nerve impulses, or artificial satellites. Whereas many attempts by humanity to exert control over the environment have proved disappointing, control theory, because it is part of the warp of nature itself, may prove to be an extremely effective tool. According to Ian Stewart, In the future, we may well use it, control theory, to control the flow of turbulent air past an aircraft wing, the population of codfish off the coast of Newfoundland, or the migration of locusts in North Africa. And we may use it to send supplies to our newly constructed moon base using only half the fuel now required. Control theory can only work if it is possible to define the outposts you want precisely and to measure them precisely too. Budgeting is a form of control mechanism, and the accounting systems that reduce the complex reality of business life to a few figures that can be measured and monitored are a good example of the value and limitations of control theory. The system of budget monitoring works quite well, but only if we all believe in the validity of the numbers presented. In reality, the information presented is necessarily distorted, and only part of what should really be monitored. Yet, alternative systems have proved too complex and unworkable. Therefore, if you're going to attempt to control something, you do need to think very carefully about the value of your measurements and whether you will really be achieving the results you want. It's a boring cliché that what gets measured gets done. Yet, the truly important things are usually the ones least measured and monitored, either because it is inherently impossible to do so, or because insufficient thought is given to what the measurement means. As an example of the latter, take a new product launch where the system monitors rates of trial by consumers. This is frequently done, yet it is the wrong measure. What matters is not trial, but repurchase rates after trial. Because repurchase is more difficult to track, the wrong measure is often used, and the whole effort has no value. Only use control theory if you are sure that you are going to measure the really important thing and that it can be measured precisely. Then do the following. 1. Define precisely what you are trying to do and how you will measure the output. 2. Measure the output. 3. Expect the output to differ from the plan. 4. Correct the output to achieve the plan by applying feedback or, if the market is telling you clearly to do so, change the plan. And finally, 5. Keep repeating the process until the output is in line with the plan. Fermat's principle of least time. The French mathematician Pierre de Fermat, 1601 to 1665, discovered that a ray of light traveling between 2 points will go the way that takes least time, not the shortest route. His mathematical proof of the principle of least time led to the laws of reflection and refraction. And going the quickest way, light is minimizing its scarcest resource, time. We can apply the same principle in business by thinking not about time, but about what is the scarcest resource. Affairs should be organized so that the scarcest resource is used most parsimoniously. Things should be arranged for the convenience of the scarcest resource. Reflect on what's really the scarcest resource in your business. If it is the time of a person, affairs should be arranged to make the most of this. There is a word for this, and it is not empowerment. The word is delegation. Delegation is not always important, but when the scarce resource truly is a person, nothing could be more crucial. The principle of delegation has, of course, been known for ages. Yet, I have only ever come across one firm among the hundreds I have known well that effectively practices delegation. The firm is Bain & Company, the eccentric firm of management consultants where I was briefly a partner some time ago. At Bain it was drilled into everyone. Never do something that a cheaper or less experienced person could do. This was a wonderful philosophy for a partner. All of life's tedious challenges, from buying a sandwich to choosing a suit, could be taken care of by juniors, I was going to say slaves, of one kind or another. Time billed by partners to clients, the scarcest and most valuable resource, was thereby maximized. Trichotomy law. My final power law to help us achieve more with less is the trichotomy law from mathematics. This states that every real number is either 0, or negative, or positive. This may seem trivial, but reflect on it in the context of value creation. We are back to less is more. In organizations and life generally, we tend to focus on the value that is created, ignoring the value that is subtracted. For example, the management hierarchy clearly has value in helping the top people achieve the organization's objectives. Or, individual executives clearly add value in the course of their jobs. Or, the organization benefits from having a sister division that is able to share some costs, such as a joint sales force. But this is not the end of the story. Every activity, unit, or person that adds value may also, and probably does, subtract value as well. The management hierarchy may demotivate people down the line, insulate them from thinking about the business themselves, or lead them to pay more attention to their bosses than to customers. Individual executives may have great strengths, but great weaknesses too, that require cleanup or damage limitation exercises all around them. The sister division may share the cost of the sales force, but limit its effectiveness in selling your most profitable products, which may require a focus on a different sort of customer. For every plus, there's likely to be a minus. What matters is the net result. We nearly always err in looking at the positive side and neglecting the negative. One reason that we can achieve more with less is that we can decide not to do things that actually have negative value. Here we have benefit twice. Once because cost is removed, and again because we remove a negative effect that is greater than the positive effect. The easiest and often the best way to add to personal or organizational effectiveness is simply to stop doing things that subtract net value. If you can't see what you routinely do, or what the organization routinely does, that subtracts value, ask your colleagues. Be prepared for a long list. Summary. To create wealth, we must do more with less. The 80-20 principle describes how the world works and shows us how to do more with less. The secret is to identify the powerful forces that have more than their fair share of impact. If they are forces that can help us, we should try to maximize them and ride them. If they are harmful forces, we must remove or avoid them. Because roughly 80% of corporate assets, activity, and decisions lead to only 20% of profits or value, it follows that corporations should be much more selective and careful. They should own less, acquire less, divest more, focus on fewer stages of the value chain, and reduce their number of products, customers, suppliers, and employees. The positive side is to find the 20% of activity that adds 80% of the value, and increase it. The 80-20 principle also applies to individuals and to their effectiveness in their careers and private lives alike. Corporations and executives should seek to control far less, but to control the few things that really matter much more rigorously. Control theory can help here, but only if there is very careful thought about the objectives and measurements. The best way to start to get more from less is to stop all activities that subtract more value than they add. Action implications. 1. Achieve more with less. Make this your resolution every year, month, week, and day. 2. Start by applying the 50 to 5 principle. Identify the least important or profitable half of the number of products, customers, and suppliers that contribute only 5% of sales. Cut them. 3. Move on to the 80-20 principle. Identify the 80% of products, customers, suppliers, and employers that contribute only 20% of value. Make them much more profitable or productive, if this is possible, or if it isn't, remove them over time. 4. Focus all your energies on increasing the 20% of business, whether defined by customers, products, or any other measure, that contributes 80% of the value. Try to sell more of the same or similar products to the relevant customers or others who share similar characteristics. 5. Be extremely sparing in what you own, the capital you use, the acquisitions you make, and the number of stages of value added in which you participate, and what you try to control. Over time, make your company more virtual and more focused on the minority of activity that delivers most of the value. 6. Make your firm as simple as possible. 7. Develop skill in managing and exerting influence beyond your organization's boundaries. 8. Identify the scarcest, most valuable resource in your organization and arrange everything else to make the best use of this scarce resource. And finally, 9. Think about and measure value subtracted as well as value added. Identify whatever activities or links subtract more value than they add, and cut them. Stop any activity that you or others engage in if the value subtracted is nearly as great as, or is greater than, the value added. Chapter 11. On Punctuated Equilibrium, the Tipping Point, and Increasing Returns. First, there is the mountain. Then, there is no mountain. Then, there is. Zen proverb. Punctuated Equilibrium. At the start of Chapter 4, we looked briefly at punctuated equilibrium, the theory that evolution consists of long periods of stability, punctuated by short periods of rapid transition. When a species evolves, conditions can be stable for millions of years. Then there is a sudden leap, which takes place very quickly, and new species are formed. Evolution proceeds by a series of lurches, and everything is different. Here we will explore this key power law in more detail, with particular stress on changes in technology and the way they follow the pattern of punctuated equilibrium. The inventions of the 19th century, such as railroads, gas, electricity, and automobiles, marked such a punctuation point. Probably of roughly comparable importance in the later 20th century were the surge in computing power, telecommunications, genetic engineering, and the Internet. Technological change is the main determinant of long-term growth everywhere. Besides opening up new possibilities and creating new needs, technology provides more for less. As well as driving up standards, it lowers costs dramatically. Indexed to 100 in 1930, the cost of air transport per mile and per passenger had fallen to around 17 by 1980. The charges for using satellites fell from 100 in 1980 to about 15 in 1990. The cost of a 3-minute phone call from New York to London fell from 100 in 1940 to about 2 today. The most important technological changes are the general purpose or enabling technologies that transform economies and societies, that punctuate the equilibrium. The historical highlights of enabling technology include domestication of crops and animals, writing, bronze, iron, the water wheel, the windmill, the three-masted sailing ship, the printing press, automated textile machinery, the steam engine, electricity, the internal combustion engine, and the computer. Growth is very largely a function of the extent and speed with which enabling technologies are used, adapted, and spread. Recall the great Joseph Schumpeter's insistence that capitalism proceeds via creative destruction brought about by technological change. When a punctuated point is reached, the implications can be exhilarating or scary, depending on which side of the divide you sit. If you are a traditional farmer, determined to follow the way that crops have been planted and grown for 1,000 years, the arrival of genetically modified crops is a threat. If you're a leader in the new methods and can triple productivity while also raising resistance to disease, there is a big opportunity. The warning period of embryonic pre-change. Punctuated equilibrium has some very intriguing and potentially profitable characteristics. Technology may lie latent or largely unexploited for several years before suddenly taking off. The potter's wheel, for instance, was invented before 1500 BC, but only applied to spinning 2.5 millennia later. Eyeglasses were invented in the 13th century by the monk Roger Bacon, who died in 1294, but only exploited on a mass scale in modern times. Leonardo da Vinci drew prototype helicopters, and much else besides, but lacked enabling power mechanisms. Capitalism's advance in the 18th century greatly shortened the period between invention and rapid deployment of new technologies. Steam power was applied within decades to every conceivable use: factories, steamships, railroad locomotives. Markets supplied incentives to introduce and diffuse new technologies. Even today, however, new technologies do not take off immediately on invention. Instead, they spend years lurking in the profitless limbo of the enthusiasts and the pioneer before exploding into mass markets. Cell phones, video recorders, and the Internet being examples. The pattern is not simply stability, then punctuation, then new equilibrium, but rather stability for a long time, followed by a much shorter but significant period of embryonic change, followed by the punctuation and then rapid transition to the new equilibrium. Change does not happen out of the blue sky. There is a warning, or warm-up, or pre-punctuation gestation period when the nature of the embryonic change is apparent to alert eyes, and yet has not happened. Plague theory. Plague theory charts how infectious diseases spread. It turns out the progress of any such disease, from the Black Death to AIDS to less serious infections, can be projected fairly accurately by calculating the proportion of the relevant population that has been infected at a few different time points, meaning years, months, or days, and then extrapolating what will happen if the rate of growth of the disease, as measured by the ratio of the infected to the not yet infected, remains constant. It is reasonable to assume that the rate of infection will be roughly constant if we adjust for the proportions of the population that, at any given time, are infected or healthy. It is worth explaining the formula because it is particularly useful in estimating how fast any new technology or new business method will spread. Assume that in month 1, 100 people will have the plague out of a population of 1 million. So, 999,900 don't have the plague. By month 2, 500 people have the plague, and 999,500 don't. In the third month, 2,500 are infected, and 997,500 are healthy. With just 3 data points like this, there is a good chance that we can predict how many people will have the plague in months 4 to 48. By month 4, some 12,300 are likely to have the plague and 987,700 to be uninfected. The formula for the projections is X is equal to F divided by 1 minus F, where X is the factor by which to measure growth, F is the percentage of the relevant population with the plague, and 1 minus F is equal to the percentage of the population not infected with the plague. The theory holds that the rate of growth in X will remain constant. What typically happens is that the proportion of the population affected by the plague will now grow rapidly and at an accelerating rate. Then will reach a point of inflection and slow down, and then decelerate rapidly, a typical S-curve. The fast initial growth comes when the number of people who are infected, and can therefore infect other people, reaches a certain critical level. The rate of increase in infection slows down when most of those susceptible to infection have been infected and the disease runs out of new people to colonize. The tipping point. If action can be taken to keep the disease below a certain critical level, then it may never reach the point of rapid acceleration, and the proportion of the population affected may end up being a fraction of what it would otherwise have been. The point at which rapid acceleration begins is known as the tipping point, when the disease tips over from being a low-level outbreak to a fully blown public health crisis. We can think of it also as the time that the disease acquires critical mass. The tipping point is therefore very similar to the time of punctuation in punctuated equilibrium. The metaphor is more graphic. One minute you are pushing water uphill, then you reach the tipping point and it's all downhill from there. All new technologies that punctuate an existing equilibrium and then replace it with another equilibrium must pass their tipping point. If they don't, they will never become dominant or cause significant change to a business system. The same idea can be applied to any new product, fad, or trend. A new social habit, such as jogging, taking ecstasy, rollerblading, or following a new rock group, may initially make little headway. It may stay confined to a small subculture or area. Then it may begin to gather momentum. If it crosses an invisible line, it may never look back. If it doesn't cross the line, it will remain a small minority interest. That invisible line is the tipping point. The idea of the tipping point is enormously valuable if you are trying to launch a new technology or product, or trying to assess what impact someone else's innovation will have. The key point is that at no stage is effort or expense proportional to results. In the earlier stages, a terrific amount of cash and energy may be invested, with little apparent payoff. At this point, many pioneers cut their losses. Yet, if the tipping point can be reached, it's all downhill from there. Sales and profits snowball, with relatively little incremental investment. Microsoft's profits were tiny for its first 10 years, but once the tipping point was reached around 1985, they exploded. So too for Federal Express. Beyond its tipping point, in the early 1980s, it was impossible not to compound profits like crazy.